The IAEA, a UN agency, has once again shown that it is acting on a political capacity rather than a technical one. At least that's the view from Iran. The IAEA Board of Governors adopted a politically motivated anti-Tehran resolution on a country that has the most transparent, peaceful nuclear program. Does this act deserve a countermeasure that Iran at this point is contemplating? Should it involve the level of cooperation with the IAEA? If Iran does decide to take that route, wouldn't that jeopardize Iran's membership at the NPT? Or has Iran not reaped the benefits of being an NPT member? Just a few of the questions we'll be asking our guests in this edition of The Spotlight. First, let me introduce them. Don DeBar is an activist and commentator, joining us from OSSINING, New York. Also joining us is John Bosnitch Journalist, activist and political analyst, who joins us from Belgrade. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. I'll start with you, John Bosnitch, taking a look at this anti-Iran IAEA resolution. It's not in the best spirit of cooperation, to say the least. It's brought forward by the U.S. and the E3, namely Germany, France, and Germany. Germany and France, part of the E3. And also, it has censored Iran over insufficient cooperation. What do you make of another resolution that it has leveled against Iran, given the sensitivity, obviously, of the whole picture and the whole matter here?
It only looks worse and worse. This is a trend of behavior that we've been seeing for years against Iran. And that is obviously because of the Israeli lobby and its influence on the American government and on the American personnel inside the IAEA. This does not look good. It looks like yet another provocation to create a false grounds for aggressive action against Iran.
What kind of aggressive action do you think?
Well, you know, when we're talking about the United States in this day and age, especially with a warmonger like Joseph Biden in power, anything is on the table. And the slightest provocation that they can invent, such as the latest provocation that they used in Ukraine about so-called Russian missiles landing in Poland, they can invent any excuse that they want. They just use the IAEA to make it a little bit more believable to those naive people around the world who still trust in such institutions.
Don DeBar, what do you think about the timing of the resolution being passed at this point?
Well, right, it's the 17th of November, right, which is last Thursday or Wednesday, whatever. You know, isn't that the same day that the rocket landed in Poland, or the day following the rocket landing in Poland? You know, it's very interesting that we're discussing the nuclear non-proliferation treaty at this moment, and Iran as the great offender, as opposed to, let's say, for example, the United States. In 1970, when the treaty was put together, it was envisioned, and in fact, it was written into the body of it, that there would be a disarmament at some point in the not so distant future. You know, that's been 52 years now. And the United States only at the last year of the Obama administration, so 5 years ago, actually budgeted to spend $1 trillion on nuclear weapons. And the language of the history of the law of this thing is interesting also. I'll try not to be too lengthy with this, but there was an advisory opinion that was requested by the World Health Organization back in the 90s that came out of the International Court of Justice. It issued on July 8th of 1996, asking a number of questions about the legality of using the threat of nuclear war as a deterrence, or actually using nuclear weapons, and under which conditions, et cetera, would it be legal or illegal? You know, as absurd as this sounds, like, once they blow the world up, who cares if it was a code violation? But the questions were entertained by the court, and one particular question was the one that was divisive. You had 14 judges from 14 different countries, and they split 7-7 on one question, and that is it legal to use nuclear weapons in the event that the very existence of the state is threatened? The United States and its allies, Japan, Germany, et cetera, voted that it is not legal to do so. Russia, China, and some others basically, they voted that, yes, it is legal to do so. In other words, these weapons can be used if you try to take down our state, our government. And the United States disagrees. This is very important at this moment right now, because while these people are trying to enable the United States to perpetuate sanctions and all kinds of other warfare against Iran, the actual threat of nuclear war exists and is being stoked by the United States on a daily basis in Ukraine. And the question about whether or not Russia, if the Russian state were taken down, as the United States has been trying to do since this war started, like it's trying to do to Iran also with sanctions and everything else, that would Russia then be entitled to use nuclear weapons? And they've said our doctrine includes 2 cases where we'll use them, which is in total compliance with the ICJ's ruling. 1, in the event of a nuclear attack on us, and 2, in the event that you do something to us that threatens the survival of our state.
Sure.
And that question is something that should be entertained by the IAEA and the International Court of Justice and whatever else is going on anywhere else in the world today, while the possibility of nuclear war is a very real threat.
Well, the IAEA, John Bosnitch, as Iran sees it, is not acting in a technical capacity, but rather it's been influenced, for example, by Israel, as you, I think, mentioned, and also just influenced by political matters that are then leading to the consequential direction given by the U.S. and the E3 consequentially. But at this point, the timing is also something that needs to be discussed. Before we get into that, though, it seems like there is some kind of schism, some kind of uncertainty, unless it's by design, that's coming from the U.S. in particular. Just recently, the Pentagon's new nuclear posture review, the NPR, actually came out and said that the U.S. believes that Iran is not pursuing a nuclear weapon. But at the same time, you have the U.S. President, Joe Biden, and his administration still threatening military action against Tehran, which they say is to prevent it from acquiring one. Those two don't go together, do they?
They don't go together at all. And I think you came across the correct point that the IAEA is not just being influenced by the Israel lobby and by the U.S. government. The IAEA has become a primary instrument of pre-aggression. In other words, they create the scenario, they make the false charges, they do not prove the charges, and then they use the false, unproven charges to stoke the fires of aggression against you. And once these fires of aggression are lit, then Israel can act unilaterally, illegally, of course. America can act unilaterally, illegally, of course, and just say that, well, the IAEA already reported that this was happening, and we simply couldn't wait for the inefficient United Nations to take any action. And that is the formula for aggression. And I have to say that Iran, as I've said through all of these discussions on this topic, must be ready for the worst. That's what it is.
Okay, well, if Iran has to be ready for the worst, Don DeBar, at the same time, it is doing what it can under the guidelines, as an NPT member, and has presented itself as having the most peaceful nuclear program in terms of the number of facilities, et cetera, but also has provided the means for the IAEA to exercise the most intense inspection regime ever in its history. So if it's not reaping the rewards of that cooperation, what would you do if you were Iran?
I mean, it's very difficult to imagine that they could do any more to assuage the concerns of the world about their nuclear weapons program. In a state that the world refers to as a theocratic state, the highest religious officials have said that this is something that we are not allowed to do by our faith. And then, in terms of the study of the science of developing these weapons, you open your facilities to these people for years in a way that no other nation has done. No one. I mean, compare and contrast the access that the IAEA and even like the New York Times and Washington Post and CNN, and a host of others have had to the laboratories in Iran with the access that was provided to the biowarfare laboratories that the U.S. operated in Ukraine. I mean, what exactly are we talking about? We have the United States with, again, $1 trillion worth of just nuclear weapons and an annual military budget on the books of $750 billion every year for as far back as I can remember. And the military force assembled by that, pointed at the whole world, occupying more than half the world physically, threatening nuclear devastation of the entire planet. Physically, in actuality, we have the weapons, okay? And then looking at Iran, who might possibly have touched some material that turned into UO2 or something, and there's 3 grains of it over here, maybe, or might have been on somebody's shoe when they came to inspect. And that is the big catastrophe facing the world right now. Iran, who's never invaded anyone, is a threat with nuclear weapons that they don't have, and being accused by the biggest bully on the block, who is in the middle of destroying, at the moment, at least 7 nations.
That's true. Well, my approach here is testing through my questions to both of you the patience that Iran has displayed or should not display anymore. Again, that's up to you to analyze. John Bosnitch, coming at another, through another angle on this, we're looking at acts of sabotage that Iran has experienced, from its nuclear scientists that have been assassinated to the most recent, as far as I recall, the Karaj nuclear facility that was sabotaged, where not even a condemnation, which Iran asked the UN agency, the IAEA, to actually come out and voice, did the IAEA do? Why would the IAEA not even come out and condemn what was an apparent act of sabotage? It was very obvious, and yet it refrained from doing that. Why do you think that is?
Each of these examples are just a reinforcement of the general thesis that I've put forward here, that the IAEA is nothing of the sort. The IAEA is a spying organization which only spies on enemies of the United States and Israel. I would suggest that the only way to shut these liars up is to relocate the headquarters of the IAEA inside Iran, inside your nuclear facilities, and wait until Israel or America tries to make a sneak attack to bomb them. And when they kill the IAEA inspectors themselves, then the world will know what's what, because you've provided video, you've provided physical monitoring, you've provided other monitoring from the sky, from satellites, and nothing works because the lies perpetrated by the lying mainstream media are bigger to the common person's eye than the truth.
The Israeli influence on the IAEA has been stated time and again, and there's plenty of material out there. But nowhere was it so displayed so ostentatiously, Don DeBar, was when the resolution, which happened on June 8th by the Board of Governors, was issued. And just weeks before, you had Rafael Grossi make a controversial visit, as it was called, to Israel. And then, of course, we come out from that, and then you have that resolution issued. Again, what would Iran and should Iran view that to be? This visit to Israel and then having a resolution to be issued against Iran?
Well, it's a part of a whole cloth. There's the history of Israel illegally making military attacks on Iran's facilities. Illegal, under international law. Never disciplined. You can't even bring it up at the Security Council. The U.S., France, UK immediately veto it before it gets out of your mouth. You have, of course, Wesley Clark's list, okay, of the 7 countries that the U.S. was going to take down, and Iran was prominent on the list. And you also have the term that was invented for Israel of nuclear ambiguity. No one else in the world is allowed to be ambiguous about nuclear weapons except Israel. That speaks volumes in my book. This is in the center of, this cauldron, as they term it, of the Middle East, with all the warfare that goes on there, mostly brought in from the outside by the U.S. And the other former colonial powers, the now puppet colonial powers. And in addition to that, by the way, Israel being the only one that has conducted a genocide in that region of the people, the indigenous people there, which is ongoing, by the way. The whole world knows it. It's an open secret. You're not allowed to say it out loud. But there's been a genocide conducted by Europeans in the Middle East on the land that was called Palestine, that contains people that are still called Palestinians, those that are left. And this is the power that has allowed nuclear ambiguity in the middle of the region, while Iran, who was never invaded anyone and has a civilization sitting on that land going back a few thousand years, is the great danger to the neighborhood. It strains. I don't know. I don't have words.
Well, we were looking at the JCPOA revival talks, which are also called sanctions removal talks, to have made progress or to have digressed. It was back and forth in a sense in the past months. And then you had what has happened in the past 2 months, of which the Iranian government, the spokesperson, has reacted to it, and that's the rioting that has taken place in some parts of Iran. And without saying it outright, it did make references to the point that the E3 and the U.S. are trying to take advantage of that situation and then forward that resolution to the Board of Governors in order for it to then be issued against Iran. Do you think that that is maybe one of the driving factors behind the resolution? This is for John Bosnitch. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, obviously, yes, it is. Obviously, the entire situation of these renewed demands of inspections is a setup. Obviously, Iran is being led down the garden path by performing what it's being asked to do and then being condemned for not having done what it did in front of inspectors. This is a lie so big that one has, I mean, as an individual who grew up on the border of the United States, in Canada, in a so-called democracy, when I see this and the mistreatment of Iran, it makes me wonder about every single guiding principle we were taught in school as children. Everything we lived through and everything they taught us appears to be a lie. This is today's world, and it's a real pity that individuals like myself, who were raised in the West and educated in the West and excelled in their system, find ourselves ostracized from the regimes that created our own mentality because they lie too much for us to believe a single word that they say.
I got to address that same question to you, Don DeBar, and to use the words of the Iran spokesperson. He said the U.S. and EU are trying to, quote, take advantage of recent conditions strictly with the motivation and the goal of exerting political pressure on Iran. Again, without mentioning the rioting that was taking place. Your reaction to that, and also how can Iran trust the parties to, at this point it's not even, I'm not even sure if there is anything in the works, but if there were to be a deal, how could Iran trust those parties when they have reacted the way they have throughout this whole time, in terms of all the different, not only resolutions, but the way they've treated Iran inconsistently and questioning Iran's sincerity when it comes to its operations?
Well, let me answer the original question first, please. It's important to note something, okay? Look at these, basically the wars that were being conducted still, against Libya and Syria, and contrast them. They were able to knock down the regime, the government, the state in Libya, and not in Syria. And the decisive factor really was air power. The enabling resolutions, 1970 and 1973 in the United Nations regarding Libya, enabled, whether allowed or not, but enabled and brought a 8-month or 7-month, whatever, daily air bombardment campaign in conjunction with the terrorist attacks on the ground. In Syria, because Russia and China repeatedly vetoed resolutions that would have enabled an air attack in Syria, the government was able to buy time, and then Russia came in and provided air support. And so the Syrian state is actually stable. If under siege, it's still stable. When you see a situation like you've experienced in Iran recently unrolled, and this is another wave of what they did after the election 10 or 12 years ago, that this is the U.S. government attacking. And the activity that we're seeing coordinate with that at the IAEA, clearly, in my mind, is intended to provide some raison for an aerial attack that can operate in coordination with the ground attack that's failed. And so I think you have to consider that as an organic whole when you're looking at these things, and consider that defenses should be raised in that manner. I'm no military strategist, but looking at what has happened and what's unfolding here, that seems obvious to me. With respect to, what was the second part of the question? I'm sorry.
The second part was, how could Iran trust these parties if there's a possibility of a deal at all, even in the works right now? That's something after all this time. And that's something that happened with the previous, when the JCPOA was signed. Of course, the different areas where they failed Iran in many respects, and it wasn't even a takeoff from the ground when the JCPOA was enacted, but the issue of trust.
All right, well, across the table from Iran, who you're supposed to trust are basically the architects of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and consequently its child, the IAEA. That treaty was developed, sold, adopted around the world on the claim that, A, it would stop the spread of nuclear weapons from the states. There were 5 primary states, the same ones that are on the Security Council, and 4 or 5 others, India, Pakistan, et cetera. That would be it. And nuclear weapons were going to sunset sometime in the not too distant future. They would be gone. The scourge would be gone. Well, obviously they haven't. And the United States, again, just spent $1 trillion upgrading theirs, recently. And in addition to that, the United States developed this doctrine, I don't know what else you could call this, scam, of saying, well, if we are occupying Poland, for example, or Germany, or somewhere else, and we bring our nuclear weapons in there and base them in that country, that's not really proliferation. And so that's who you're sitting across the table from. You can't trust them at all. How did the JCPOA work out?
Right, indeed. Well, John Bosnitch, last question to you since we're out of time. Just to be clear, Director of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, Dr. Mohammad Islami, has said that Iran not only will give a firm response, but it has also said that he will continue his peaceful nuclear program. So in that case, we want to be clear, which is in compliance with its international obligations. Is the U.S. trying to take advantage of the situation currently happening in Iran to use that as not a barter, but a means for negotiations, because it is still interested in making this thing work, do you think?
Look, as a former head of state advisor, I can tell you that the current situation in Iran is a situation that the United States is provoking at the same time. U.S. agents are working inside your country right now to provoke protests. Whatever grievance there might have been, it has been amplified by the U.S. State Department and by the CIA inside your country already. So you can take it this way. They are attacking you on the IAEA side. They are attacking you by organizing protests, expansion inside your country, and they will definitely try new tactics. As I've always said, the only protection against American militarism and unilateralism is to tie up with other countries that are threatened by the same thing.
Thank you so much, John Bosnitch. Journalist, activist, and political analyst. Don DeBar, pleasure. Activist and commentator from OSSINING, New York. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From Commentator and the team, it's goodbye.